Now, the whole idea behind connection pooling is that it saves the overhead of creating new connections. You know, people sometimes are concerned about connections because of their licensing. They have a certain limited number that they can use. But many people now, especially in web applications, are going toward a type of licensing that's processor-based, where, you're not really limited in the number of connections. But even so, you still should be aware that just opening a connection actually takes some resources on the server. The server has to check and authenticate the user account and figure out permissions that are going to be allowed on that connection and so on. So you want to save that extra work by opening connections as infrequently as possible. And yet you don't want to keep a whole lot of unnecessary connections open. And so, how do you strike that balance? Well, this is where connection pooling comes in. Because what happens with connection pooling is when your application closes a connection, that connection, instead of being really destroyed, is actually placed in a pool. And this pool is one that has a certain limited size. So if the pool is full, then any new connections will just automatically be destroyed. But as long as there are, not quite enough connections in the pool, then connections that get closed will be added to the pool. And then when you go to open a connection, instead of actually doing the work of creating a new connection to the server, what pooling allows is it'll go and see if it can find a connection that exactly matches a connection in the pool. In other words, it'll check that the connection you're asking for uses a connection string that is 100% identical to the connection string of a connection in the pool. It's very important to realize that it's not just that you have to be set to the same properties. In other words, if you have one connection in the pool that says initial catalog equals Northwind, and you open a connection where you specify database equals Northwind, well, in reality, those would both be the same connection. But the pooling mechanism isn't that smart. It doesn't try and figure out, what you meant. It just looks at what you said. And so it won't reuse the initial catalog equals Northwind if what you're looking for is database equals Northwind. It'll create a new connection with database equals Northwind, and then that'll, create a new pool. So you want to be sure to be very consistent. In fact, even if you just have an extra space between the equal sign, in a connection string, that will make a difference. So it has to match exactly. When you dispose a connection, like if you create your connections in a using block, those disposed connections are closed and they are placed in the pool. So the connection still exists even though you call dispose, as long as there was still room for it in the connection pool. But the variable, the object that you were using to reference the connection after dispose has been called, is not going to still have that connection string in it. Now, in a using statement, dispose gets called automatically when the end of the block comes. But it's possible to call dispose yourself, and people sometimes wonder, well, should I call connection.close or should I call connection.dispose? And really the only difference is that if you call connection.close, the connection string property is still set there. And so you could reopen the connection without having to make a change. On the other hand, if you call connection.dispose, you'll have to reset the properties of that object before you can call its open event successfully. Just a minor difference there. In either case, pooling is still going to apply. There are some new methods and properties for working with connection pooling in using the SQL Client.NET Provider. So the SQL connection object has these two new methods, clear pool and clear all pools. And if you call clear pool on a connection, it will just clear out any connection in the pool that has that exact same connection string. Whereas if you call clear all pools, then it will, completely empty any connection pool. So the terminology is used, kind of imprecisely. Some people will talk about a connection pool as if there's only one, and that this connection pool can have, many different stringed connections in it. But in reality, the more precise way of talking about this is that you can actually have a pool for each connection string. So for each connection string, there's a pool that can have multiple connections available. So you could have multiple pooled connections that all have the same connection string. And this is, if you have a very busy application where you might be, moving things in and out of the pool even without changing the connection string. Now, when you call clear pool or clear all pools, even the open connections, the connections that are actively being used at the time, are going to be affected. They will be marked so that when they close, they won't be put back in the pool. So you can be assured that as of that point, the pool is empty and no connections that are open at that time are going to be placed in the pool. Okay?